Hey guys, today we're going to talk about all things social. So we're going to talk about a number of very interesting studies that have been done in the field of social psychology to examine how people interact with other people and how that influences not only their behaviors but their beliefs. So the whole idea is that social psychology is themed around the idea that no man is an island, right? We always interact with other people. And so studying those interactions is paramount to understanding how society actually operates. So we look at how people think about other people, how people can impact other people's actions through influence, and how we relate to one another. So social psychology is a very broad field, but it always focuses on human relationships. A key question that we might ask involves the idea of thinking about other people. So when thinking about other people, how do you think about what their behavior says about them? Are they absent frequently because they're ill or lazy or stressed out? Were the people that perpetrated the acts on 9/11 crazed, evil people? Or were they simply ordinary people corrupted by life events? So there are a number of ways that we can explain behavior, and oftentimes how we explain the behavior of others says a lot about us as well. So, for example, when we look at this, we call this the attribution theory, where we look at how people attribute other people's actions. Do they attribute them to internal events, so something that's a characteristic of the person, or do they attribute the behaviors to situational factors? And what we'll see is that people tend to attribute behaviors to personality factors more often than they do situational factors, whereas we tend to attribute our own behaviors to situational factors instead of personality factors. So this tendency is known as the fundamental attribution error, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But some examples are basically, for example, a teacher might wonder whether or not the child's hostility reflects an aggressive personality or a reaction to a stressful or abusive situation at home. So the dispositions are enduring personality traits. So these are things that are basically characteristics of who you are as a person. Think about when you are driving down the road and you see someone cut you off. Many times your first inclination is to say, what an asshole. Well, that description of asshole fits into a dispositional attribution, saying that it's something with their personality that caused them to cut you off. Now, had you looked a little bit closer, you might have seen that they had just gotten cut off, and the only way to avoid an accident with that car was to swerve in front of your lane. Now, if you did see that and you see, oh my gosh, well, I'm so glad that he didn't hit me or anybody else because that was a rough situation. That would be a situational attribution. Now, clearly, depending on the facts of the matter and what you witness, if you witness the situation, then you're more likely to give that situational attribution. But if no situation is visibly apparent, then you often go with the dispositional attribution. So like I said, that's the fundamental attribution error. Technically speaking, the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overestimate the impact of personal disposition and underestimate the impact of situations in analyzing the behaviors. Now, the thing is about the fundamental attribution error is that there's another side, which is how you view your own behaviors. You view your own behaviors more often than not as the result of situation. So I didn't perform well on that test, not because I'm a bad student, but because the questions weren't related to what was in the material on the lecture slides. The teacher was asking too much. So you see, you're estimating yourself as saying, it's not anything I did wrong, it's the situation. Whereas if your little brother or sister performed poorly on a test, you might say, well, you should have studied harder. That is something that was a flaw from within. So the fundamental attribution error really colors how we interact with others and ourselves. The interesting thing about the fundamental attribution error is that it's not culturally homogeneous. What I mean by that is that the fundamental attribution error is different in different cultures. In fact, when you live in more individualistic societies, like the United States, you tend to see the fundamental attribution error is at a higher level. People tend to do this more often. Whereas in more collectivistic societies, like, say, Japan or China, where they look a lot at group work, what we see is that in those societies, that people actually tend to do the opposite. They tend to explain it away more as a situational characteristic than as a personal disposition. So our fundamental attribution error is not hardwired, but rather influenced quite heavily, and this should come as no surprise, by the society in which you live. Right? So if it's all about social thinking, then clearly society is going to impact how it develops. And so this is why we see culturally different forms of the fundamental attribution error. We're all guilty of it. It doesn't make you a bad person, but be aware of it. And know that maybe the next time that guy cuts you off, maybe it's not because he's an asshole. Maybe it's because he didn't see you, or there are many other factors that could have contributed. So this is a visual display, which is exactly what I just described. I probably shouldn't even show you this slide, but yeah. Negative behavior, guy cuts you off. Maybe the driver's ill. That's a situational decision. Dispositional attribution, oh, he's an asshole, he's a crazy driver. Now, the reason why it's important to consider both possibilities, that maybe the guy's an asshole or maybe something's going on, is because both of those can impact how we interact with other people. You see, it's all very interesting to look at, you know, whether or not we attribute someone's behavior to a situation or a disposition. But what's more important is that those color our interactions with those individuals from here on out. So if we view someone as having a negative disposition when in reality it was just a situation that caused them to act that way, we could continue a negative interaction with that person, you know, for there on out. So had this individual assumed that the driver was ill, they would proceed with more caution. They would allow the driver to have a lot of room because they may swerve in and out and cause an accident. However, if you think that that guy's a jerk, well, then you might make it harder for him to pass you in the future. You might drive up and tailgate him. Road rage, essentially. You might be a jerk right back to him. Now, had you given this unfavorable reaction to someone that really deserved this tolerant reaction because they were ill, think about what you could do. You could cause an accident. So it's important to consider both the situational factors that might impact behavior and the dispositional factors. And think about how that colors your reactions and your interactions with other people. So in that same vein, actions can lead you to hold an attitude. So you have an attitude or a belief about that person, and that predisposes you to interact with them in a certain way. So if you believe that someone is mean and you dislike them, then you're going to act like a bitch to them. That's just the way it works. You know, I mean, there are people that I don't like, and I catch myself doing this all the time. I'll dismiss what they say, even if they have a good idea, because my attitude exists, and it's hard to change that. But the important factor is that attitudes don't just sit in your mind. They can actually change your behaviors. Now, it's actually cyclical, and we're going to discuss this in a minute, that actions can impact your attitudes, and attitudes can impact your actions. So one of the most fun things that we can do is, look at changing people's attitudes. And you know, the idea that it's so difficult to do so, it's really not. Core beliefs are difficult to change, attitudes are not. So the attitudes predict our behavior somewhat, but there are so many external factors that influence our behavior. So as a result of that, we see some differences, and we're going to discuss those. So, like I said, it's cyclical here. So actions interact with attitudes in a cyclical fashion. Not really much more I can say about that. So, let me go back. Let me see here. All right, there we go. I'll go back to the other slides in a second. So if actions can affect attitudes and attitudes can affect actions, what happens when they disagree? Well, that's one of the important and fun things to study. If you have a behavior that directly conflicts with an attitude, or even if you have two attitudes that directly conflict, they lead to the sensation of discomfort, the sensation of tension that's internal, called cognitive dissonance. Now, we don't like cognitive dissonance. It makes us feel bad because you have to ask yourself, well, then, if I act this way, but I believe in a different way, what does that say about me? So oftentimes, to relieve this tension, we bring our attitudes closer to our actions. Sometimes we bring our actions closer to our attitudes, but it's often easier to bring our attitudes in line with our actions. In large part because actions tend to be non-thought processes. So you often engage in actions without thinking about it, and it's sometimes easier to change your attitude. So I'll come back to this slide in a minute, but a perfect example is smokers. Smokers are quite possibly one of the easiest groups to examine cognitive dissonance because they know, logically, that smoking cigarettes is dangerous. It puts them at a greater health risk, and nobody likes that idea of having a greater health risk. So how do they change their attitude to align with the fact that they're not going to quit smoking because quitting smoking is very difficult? Well, the easiest way to align their attitudes with their actions is to say things like, oh, well, it's only taken off the bad years anyway, who gives a shit? And that's a frequent decision that people make. They change their attitude to say that it's only taking away the bad years. Or, well, I don't really mind. That's one of the ways that we can consolidate cognitive dissonance to make us feel better about the situation. So let me go back a couple slides and I'll get back to what I was talking about. So in addition to attitudes impacting behaviors, there's a specific targeted way that you can impact someone's behavioral decisions. And this is through what's known as the foot in the door phenomenon, which basically states that if you want someone to like you and be willing to engage in further activity with you, specifically behaviors that are going to work in your benefit, in other words, requests, then the best way to go about that is to do a small request first and then follow that up with a large request over time. So a perfect example might be if you were walking around and you wanted to raise money for the for a wildlife foundation. So the first thing that you do is you walk around a neighborhood and you say, hey, here's the deal, this is what we're doing, we're not asking you for any money. What we would like to do is ask you to help us spread the word. So what we have here are these yard signs. We made these up, and all we're asking is, would you mind if we placed one of these on your front lawn? This way we can get the word out and people will know what's going on, they'll see our website, and if they wish to donate, they can do so. Very small request. All we're asking is a small piece of your lawn. If you agree with the cause, it should be no problem, right? Well, then those individuals come back a month later and say, hey, this is working out really well. We really appreciate you doing this for us. We were wondering, are you now interested in donating? So this is that foot in the door phenomenon. So you give people a small request, and they're more likely to comply later with a bigger request. It's actually a pretty profound effect and part of what makes a lot of successful marketing campaigns work out. In addition to all of that I've just described, your actions can actually impact your attitudes. So one of the key studies that really looked at this, they were looking at how people act in different situations. And so Philip Zimbardo did what's known as the Stanford prison experiment. And so what he did was he actually went through extensive screening of these individuals. So when I show you the video about it, I'm going to link to it, and you'll learn about the study a little bit more in depth. It's shocking to see how people reacted when these people were screened specifically for mental stability and the ability to perform well under stress. So what he did was he selected the highest caliber of student and invited them to an experiment. This experiment was the prison experiment set up in the basement of the psychology building at Stanford. So what he did was he assigned the role of guards or prisoner to random students. The guards were selected and given uniforms and told of their activities. These students that were selected as prisoners were picked up, essentially kidnapped, brought to the jail cell, and they lived there. Now, the interesting fact about it is that very soon thereafter, the guards began displaying behaviors that were disturbing. Zimbardo himself began displaying behaviors that were disturbing. He didn't even realize how disturbing the whole event was until his girlfriend threatened to leave him because she was so appalled by what was going on down there. Now, when I say what was going on down there, you have no idea what was happening. So let me tell you. These guards were, forcing inmates to do various sets of exercises. They were engaging in humiliation exercises, forcing them to act out in behaviors that would be otherwise not in line with how they typically act. For instance, they would make inmates kiss or dance together in an effort to embarrass them. And this is something that happened very quickly. In fact, it happened so quickly that within a matter of days, students were having breakdowns and demanding to leave the study. And so they would bring in a new student to take the place of that prisoner as that student left because they had every right to leave. But the fact remains that being in that situation caused them to act out the role that they were provided with. And in fact, it also demonstrates the importance of a single individual in impacting behavioral changes. Because had one individual not been a part of the study, it might not have turned out this way. One of the prison guards had actually recently watched a spaghetti western of some sort. I don't recall exactly what he had watched. But he watched some sort of movie, and he wanted to act out in a similar fashion to a prison guard in that movie. And that prison guard was very twisted and disturbed. And so he took up that role, and that changed the whole dynamic. So, one of the reasons why we discuss Zimbardo's study is because it really examines the importance for an ethics review board. Now, he did go through an ethics review board, and he passed. I mean, they said that it was ethically sound. So, ethics have changed over time, and now a study like this wouldn't begin to happen. But it does shed light on a number of different instances. For example, the way that the guards acted at Abu Ghraib. We look at the Zimbardo study and we can extrapolate the findings from there to examine why people in a different situation would never act this way, but when put in this situation are more than willing to humiliate other human beings in a negative way. So role-playing can strongly impact your attitudes. Perfect example that's perhaps less sinister might be, being asked to write a paper contrary to your own beliefs. Sometimes doing so, writing from the perspective of someone you disagree with, can change your attitudes or your beliefs about the situation. So this is what I was saying earlier about if they don't line up, that leads to cognitive dissonance. Let me give you another example. The tuition is too damn high, but the school needs money. So knowing both of those beliefs leads to a sensation of discomfort for Fiona. She resolves that discomfort by saying, you know what, maybe the school does need the money. I'm going to accept the fact that the tuition is high because I'm getting something out of it. So we engage in reducing cognitive dissonance every single day. So if we think about things in a social manner, and we always do, that's how everything we think about is in a social manner. Well, then how do we take that and use it to influence? Well, we're going to talk about the difference between conformity and obedience, and how groups can impact your behaviors. So, a clear definition of social definition is basically saying, social influence is the impact of other people on our own behaviors. Pretty simple, right? Oftentimes, behavior is contagious, and this is evolutionary in its core. There's a reason why behaviors are contagious, because if one behavior is a positive behavior that engages in or results in a good outcome for somebody, then you want to engage in the same behavior. So we model other people's behaviors. At a certain level, that's conformity. When we conform to the same behavioral practices of our peers, that's conformity. At the higher end of the extreme is obedience, which is when we act in full compliance without question. So it's a continuum for conformity to obedience, and the studies really began with conformity studies, and then we're going to move on to some obedience studies. So conformity is simply adjusting one behavior and thinking to coincide with a group standard. So this is basically just saying that certain behaviors are contagious. If someone looks up on the street, you're probably going to look up too. There's a reason for that. That's an informational reason. There's something going on. But it's conformity nonetheless. So in this study right here that this graph is displaying, we have two different situations. One in which there is a confederate. A confederate is a person that is essentially an actor in a research study. So they're part of the study, but they're pretending to be a participant. So in one study, they're all sitting in the waiting room, apparently waiting for the study to begin, when in reality the study is the waiting room. And so the confederate rubs his face. And they counted the number of times that the actual participant rubbed their face. We also measured the number of times that they shook their foot. And what we see is that when the confederate rubs their face, the participant rubs their face in a higher level than when the confederate shakes his foot. We see the same is true for the shaking of the foot. So the basic takeaway is that if we see people engaging in certain behaviors, we tend to mirror those behaviors. And this is not something that is distinct to humans in any way, shape, or form. If you've seen that video of the man and there's a primate standing behind him at the zoo and the primate is mimicking his actions. This is conformity. This is exactly what's going on here. They are acting in a way that they believe is the best way to act because it's the way that society is acting. Of course, in that example, the monkey could just be mocking him. I don't know. They do have a sense of humor. My assumption is conformity, but it could be sheer mockery. So let's look at this one. This is what's known as the Ashline Test. So if I were to ask you, the standard line is most closely similar to which comparison line? The answer is clear, right? It's number 2. Well, suggestibility is a very subtle type of conformity, which says that if other people do something, and that runs counter to what we believe, but we believe that perhaps the group is right, then we may act in that way. So Ash did a series of studies where he had he said it was a visual perception study. And he had a group of about 10 people, 9 Confederates, 1 actual participant. So he had a whole bunch of people that were just acting. And he put the Confederate down towards the end of the line, Not necessarily the last person, but one of the last people. And so he goes down the line and he has them say out loud which line is most closely related to the standard line. Person 1 says, oh, that's easy, number 1. Person 2 says, oh, that's easy, it's number 1. 3 does the same. Oh, it's number 1, it's clearly number 1. So they go down and down the line. And as they go down the line, that last person or that one of the last people, the one that's the actual participant, may begin to get confused about his own decision. And he may begin to believe that maybe he's wrong, that maybe number 1 is really the closest one to the standard line. And so, even though it runs counter to what he truly believes, he may in fact go with the group and say, it's number 1. And what we see is that that's the case. Not in everybody, but many people are very, very susceptible to suggestibility. And these people will say whatever the group says. So, this is actually the people. And what you can see is number 6 is our actual participant. 5 and 7, they both look very relaxed. But number 6 is concerned, he's confused, and he's very frustrated. And it leads to a sensation of negativity, an internal negativity. Because it makes you question your own understanding of reality. So, he went ahead and he said, with everybody else, it was line 1. So, there are a number of factors that strengthen conformity. In his case, he felt insecure because everybody else was giving a certain answer that was not in line with his, so maybe he was having vision problems. He felt incompetent there. If it's just 2 people, it's much easier to disagree. If it's you and somebody else, then there's not a sensation that you are wrong, there's a sensation that you disagree. If it's you against 2 other people, then you may begin to wonder if you're wrong. Unanimity is one of the biggest ones, though. If everybody else says that you're wrong, well, then maybe you really are, and that's the decision that you come to, even though in this case, clearly that young man was right. Additionally, if it's a prestigious group, then we tend to follow them more blindly. So, for example, they did this study with people that had higher versus lower social standing. So they brought in the Confederates, and they made sure that the Confederates were identifiable as people that should want to be followed. And they did so by assigning some sort of arbitrary characteristic to them that was viewed as positively. Like, I believe it was like, these are math majors, right? And so a math major would clearly be someone that would perform well at a mathematical task. So it's a group status that makes them more likely to believe what they're saying. So this is an expert phenomenon, right? But it's not just experts. It could be, if you had, I don't know, a line of presidents, right? You had the past 3 presidents sitting in a room, you're going to go with whatever the hell they say, right? Because you admire their group status and you believe that they're probably right. In addition, if you don't have a prior commitment to a response, then you're more likely to conform. So if, if he was the first person to respond, and he said, no, it's line 2. And then everybody else says line 1. And then the researcher comes back around and says, so, do you want to change your decision? Well, then he might not change his decision because he's committed to it verbally. If, on the other hand, and this is the way that they tested this, the researcher had everybody write down their answers first and then verbalize them, then what they see is that those that write them down, they're writing it down and only telling it to themselves. So they're not committing to that response. So they have no commitment to that response. So then when it comes around to their question, they ignore what they wrote down and go with what the group says. And additionally, having the group observe your behavior is also important. If you're not being seen, then you respond however the hell you actually believe. But if you believe that it's going to impact your interactions with other people, then you are going to begin to conform to the group. And lastly, if one's culture encourages respect for some sort of social standard, then that will strengthen conformity. So conformity tends to exist at higher levels in cultures where, unity and social standards are heavily emphasized. If you have a cultural melting pot, this is less likely to occur because we don't have one culture here. However, if you go through different communities in the United States and you look at, different communities based on, areas where people have migrated heavily from one part of the world, you might see differences here. And so we find a cultural difference with regards to conformity. And there are two main reasons that we conform. Now, I mentioned earlier that if someone on the street looks up, you're going to look up. Well, that's the bottom form, the informative social influence, which basically says that someone in the group might be providing something very valuable. Why would I not look at whatever it is that they're looking at? Because it might be important. They could be looking up, and there could be a plane falling from the sky, and I might need to go. I might need to run. So informative social influence is basically a form of conformity where you are basing it on the assumption that there is valuable information being provided. The normative social influence, on the other hand, is the peer pressure aspect. The influence resulting from a desire to be approved of, to want to be a part of the group. So normative behavior, normative social influence is dressing a certain way. Dressing like your peers. It's actually quite common. I mean, it's everybody in some way conforms. You set who your peers are and who you conform to, but by and large, normative social influence is going to color a lot of your behaviors. So, we look at this one right here. And, this is where we look at informative social influence. So Barron looked at having students do an eyewitness identification task. Basically saying, okay, so, slide 1, this is your guy. I want you to find them on slide 2. Now, you only get a certain amount of exposure to slide 1. In one study, or in one version of the study, you get 5 full seconds. Right? So you get a lot of time to look at that person with that beard, and it becomes quite obvious what he looks like. If you only have half a second exposure, however, that changes things. So you only get a brief moment. So let's say that you're sitting there, and you get a brief flash, you only get half a second, and everybody in your room says that it's this guy right here. Right? Well, you, thinking it might be this guy, but you only had a half of a second exposure, believe, well, maybe they know something that I don't, right? So maybe they have information that I do not. And so you go with this one. If, however, you have a full 5 seconds, then you might say, no, I think I have information that they don't have, because clearly it's this guy. So the difficulty of the task impacts how much you take away from informative social influence. If it's something that's very difficult, then you tend to rely more on social influence. If, however, it's an easy task, then you tend to accept your own interpretation. So this is the graphical display of the outcome of that experiment. And what we see is that conformity is roughly 35% for the for the low importance. So let me go back and describe what I mean about the importance. So they were told, they were given a certain level of importance here. One was just saying, hey, we want to be able to test how well you view something. And the next one was saying, hey, we believe that this guy was a criminal and he's going to go to jail. So clearly there's a difference of importance there. So what we see is that if the importance is low, conformity remains regardless of difficulty at roughly 35%. If, however, the importance is high, we see that people are less likely to conform on easy judgments because they don't want to do something that's going to risk somebody. However, if it's a difficult decision, then that conformity actually increases because they want to do the right thing. So conformity is most highest for important judgments that are very difficult to determine. So that is a little disconcerting, because if people have false information, then they often conform in a way for really important decisions that are really difficult, that could lead to bad outcomes. It's a little disconcerting, but there it is. So I mentioned that conformity is on a continuum that leads to obedience. And Stanley Milgram did what's known as the Milgram Studies, where he examined the effects of authority on obedience. And we use these studies also to understand Abu Ghraib as well. So we look at both the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram's experiments to examine how Abu Ghraib actually happened. So basically what he did was he told people that they were coming in for a learning study. And the idea here was, how does punishment influence learning? Now, that was just a cover. That wasn't what the actual study was. So the real participant believed that he was in charge of another person. So this was what he believed was going on. He's sitting here in one room with the experimenter, and he has a machine. And that machine, right here, applies voltage to the other person in the other room. This other person is not there. There's really no one in this other room. There is no one here. It's just a machine, but this guy right here believes that there is someone in the other room receiving the shocks that he is providing. So when this person answers a question incorrectly, this person is supposed to shock them. Now remember, this is not a real person right here. It's actually a recording. So when the person asks the question, you know, they get a standard answer that's the same that everybody gets. So yes or no, right? Now, as they go along, the tape begins to play things that are disconcerting. And the experimenter tells the participant that he has to increase the voltage as the responses get worse and worse. So he begins to hear things like, "I'm having trouble breathing, my heart." And after a while, the participant stops responding altogether. Now, the experimenter says to the participant, "You need to continue the study. You need to continue shocking this individual." But he's non-responsive. He's fine. You should continue the study. And what we find is that way higher than was expected agreed to go all the way up to the level that would result in death. Now, here's the visual display. Now, 100% of participants were willing to go with slight pain. No big deal, right? Moderate was, again, not that bad, not that bad. But holy shit, 65% of participants were willing and able to kill somebody because someone told them to. Not just someone, an experimenter, an authority figure. So, when there is a very high authority figure and you believe that you will not be held accountable for your actions, conformity is very high, to the point where it can no longer be called conformity, it must be called obedience. 65%. So they did a number of iterations of this study, and they examined what impacts the obedience level. And what they found was that in the initial study, 65% went all the way to the end. If it was at a low prestige setting, only about 50% did. So in this case, basically what they did was they went to a, just a strip mall. Low prestige, strip mall, but it was still a study, headed by the same folks. They also had a situation where they did a shock plate. And again, this was not really being shocked, it was just actors. And they had to hold their hand, or they had to sit next to the person being shocked. And we see that conformity drops. If the person has to actually physically hold that individual's hand to the shock plate, it drops even lower. If, however, the experimenter is in another room, that's one of the biggest ways to begin to be disobedient. If the experimenter just goes away, well then yeah, they just don't do it. They just don't shock them. They say, oh yeah, I shocked him. And then again, if there is someone that's, say, just an undergraduate research assistant in charge, they're not going to conform as much. And then lastly, if people rebel, then you are more likely to rebel as well if you disagree with what's going on. So there are a number of factors that impact whether or not someone will be obedient to authority. But with ideal settings, we see that about 65% will be willing to kill somebody if told to do so by a researcher. This ran unbelievably counter to their assumptions. They thought that no more than 5% would be willing to do this. They thought that no more than 5% would go to the full death. So this was shocking to them, and this is part of why it's interesting and important to examine things that might seem common sense. You might think, oh, of course they're not gonna be willing to kill somebody, but in reality, it turns out they were. Now, what about replication? Is this a study that we should replicate? No. And there's a reason why. And this is another reason why we have more stringent IRBs than we once did. The reason why is because, sure, these people, they were debriefed, and when they left the study, they knew that nobody had been harmed. But 65% of those people left the study knowing that they were capable of killing somebody. Not just killing somebody for a reason, killing somebody because they were told to by a stranger in a lab coat. That's terrifying. And to think about all of the people that did these studies and had that realization, that's an undue psychological stress that we shouldn't be putting people under. So, while the Milgram experiment taught us a lot about how people respond to authority, it's probably best that we take this study and we don't do anything else with it other than to study it and to look at all of its different iterations. So, Ash and Milgram studies both told us a lot about conformity and obedience. That we follow social cues from others based on what we believe is best in the situation. So we become pressurized by other people's attitudes and actions. The Milgram study was a step above and beyond the Ash study in that they had an interaction with the person that was being punished. And that interaction was very negative. They heard pleas for them to stop. So Milgram's study was the one that really looks at obedience. So how does the group then impact it? If we had the Milgram study with a group of people and, we were all engaging in the same behavior and somebody stood up and said, no, this is wrong, how does that impact our behavior? So group influences are really looking at how one person's behavior within a group changes as a result of the group. There are a number of different ways that we can look at this. We can look at one person's behavior affecting another, how families impact your behavior, how teams and committees impact your behavior and attitudes. So basically what I'd like for you to do is think about this with regards to, sports and group activities. So social facilitation refers to improved performance on a task, particularly tasks that are viewed as simple. Now, I'm not speaking necessarily about simple as in it's simple for everyone, but more as in it's something that you are skilled at. So social facilitation is basically saying that when you are around others, you perform better at a task that you perform well at already because you want to perform your best. So, in this instance, this player right here is a skilled basketball player. The larger the crowd, the better she performs. Excuse me, guys. I feel like I'm losing my voice here. Now, take me on the other hand. I played volleyball in middle school. I loved the sport. I won't say that I was bad at it, but I wasn't confident in my performance. I didn't mind playing in front of crowds, but my parents being there always messed with me. I always performed worse when my parents were there. So this is the other side of social facilitation, which basically says that when a task is perceived as difficult, you perform better alone than among others, particularly those that you worry about judging you. If you don't give a shit about the opinion of those out there, then you're going to perform the same no matter what. But if you care about how they view you, then social facilitation begins to take place. Social loafing, on the other hand, is what happens when you're working in a group, and this is part of why group projects are so frustrating, because individuals in a group tend to exert less effort when they are working towards some common goal because they know that others are going to do it as well. So one of the ways that they began to study this in its earliest form was a clapping study, and it sounds silly. But basically they had a group of people clapping, and they asked them to clap. That's all they did. And then they took them individually and they asked them to clap. And they measured how frequently they were clapping and with what level of emphasis. And they found that those in a group clapped less emphatically than those that were asked to clap individually. So this is social loafing, the idea that the group will take care of it. Now, beyond that, we get to de-individuation, which is this whole idea that self-restraint and self-awareness kind of go away. You become part of the group. Your mentality is no longer one of, I am this person, this is who I am, but rather I'm just a piece of a moving thing, a moving entity. And de-individuation can be quite negative. In fact, de-individuation is one of the factors that motivates online bullying and asshole-ish behavior, trolling. Right? Because you do not feel like you are identifiable, and that you do not feel like you are anything more than just part of a group that is engaging in a type of behavior. So it's an anonymity feeling that allows you to act in ways that you might not normally act. And what we see is that, they've done studies where they find that 100 is a good solid number for de-individuation to begin to occur. That if there's less than 100 people, people tend to still cling to their identity and say, okay, I'm going to act in a way that's consistent with my beliefs. However, if you're in a group of 1,000 people who are looting, well, shit, you might as well loot too, right? You're anonymous, you're hyped up, and everybody else is doing it. So that's de-individuation, basically losing your self-awareness and acting in a way that is consistent with how the group is acting. Mobthink, right? So what happens then if you get in a group with people who have the same beliefs as you? That's good, right? Well, maybe not. What happens when you put like-minded people together is that they begin to polarize. Someone says something extreme, and everybody's like, well, we all agree, so everybody begins to become more and more extreme in their belief. So, basically what we see here is, this is why Republicans have become more and more extreme over the years. It's group polarization. They're enhancing the prevailing attitudes, and they're just kind of, pushing the envelope farther and farther. So the more like-minded a group, the more the discussions strengthen their existing beliefs, and the more extreme those beliefs become. That's part of why it's so important to include dissidents in your discussion. If you disagree with somebody, then you can then begin to moderate your decisions, and instead of becoming so polarized, you can then begin to come up with decisions that reach across the aisle for whatever it is, whatever opposite belief that you're fighting against. So this process of polarization, this process of de-individuation leads to what's known as groupthink, right? On Reddit, we like to call it the hive mind, right? It's the mode of thinking that occurs when we all want to get along. And so decision-making is overridden by the desire to just work together. So these are some examples where groupthink took over and made the wrong decision. So the key thing here, I think, from this lecture is to really consider where people are coming from, because you don't always have all of the facts. Rely on groups to give you information that is important to make a decision, but don't forget to bring your own information to the table, because while other people might know something that you don't know, you might know something that they don't know. So social influence is a very sticky question, but the key factor to remember is that we look towards others to understand what's going on in our world, because doing so has been, by and large, evolutionarily advantageous. Because if you think about it, if I'm walking in the Serengeti somewhere, and some sort of predator is behind me, and my buddy is looking behind, terrified, it's in my best interest to just go ahead and look at whatever it is that he's looking at. So social influence is good, but we should also be aware of the bad side. Next time, Comicspedia is going to take over, and he's going to talk a lot about some really interesting topics. He's actually going to take over for a significant portion of the upcoming lectures. So all I want to say is it's been really great, you guys. This has been a really fun experience. I'm really glad that you guys were a part of this, and I can't thank you enough for being here and listening and learning and asking questions. I will continue to be around. I will continue to check up on Comicspedia's lectures. I'm looking forward to watching them myself and seeing what he has to say. But feel free to ask me questions at any time. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.